You know how we do it? We sift through a whole stack of sources, all the news reports, statements.
The whole 9 yards.
And we pull out the key stuff for you. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. So today we're diving into what's happening with U.S.-China trade lately.
Right.
Why the new Taiwan dollar seems to be, well, soaring.
It really have been, yeah.
And we'll check in on Warren Buffett's latest thoughts on the economy.
Exactly. It's all sort of connected, recent news, official statements, expert opinions. We're trying to weave it all together.
The goal is just to give you a clear picture, the insights that matter, without you having to wade through everything.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the U.S.-China trade scene. We touched on the Trump tariffs before. Now things with Canada and Mexico under USMCA seem, well, relatively stable, right?
Yeah, those tariff exemptions are pretty much set for qualifying goods. Indefinite, so less trauma there.
But the big question, like always, is China. Yeah. Any real movement on negotiations?
Well, no major breakthroughs to report, honestly. Trade relations are stable, I guess you could say. But there are definitely some breadcrumbs.
Oh.
President Trump mentioned China's interested in talking again. And interestingly, a Chinese vice premier, He Lifeng, is actually planning a trip to Switzerland.
Switzerland. Very neutral ground.
Exactly. He's set to meet with U.S. officials there this week, May 9th to 12th.
Okay. So is this seen as like a potential restart? Could we actually see some movement towards, I don't know, some kind of agreement?
That's the hope in some quarters. It's definitely being watched as a possible reboot of talks. One source even suggested we might get some kind of news this week.
Okay, fingers crossed, maybe. But probably not holding our breath for a massive deal right away?
Probably not. I mean, the initial talks might even focus on things that aren't direct trade issues, like fentanyl, for example.
Ah, okay. So easing back into it.
Yeah. A big comprehensive agreement. Seems unlikely straight off the bat. The general expectation is that the long-term relationship will be more, well, one source called it fighting and talking.
Fighting and talking. Sounds familiar. So this ongoing tension or lack of resolution, it feeds into that background worry about a U.S. recession, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That Wall Street Journal survey you mentioned, it still puts the probability around 30 to 40%, which is, not insignificant.
Definitely not.
But here's an interesting angle. Some analysis suggests that if the U.S. and China did reach a trade agreement, that recession probability could drop quite significantly, maybe down towards 20%.
Wow, really? That just shows how much weight this relationship carries for the whole economy.
It really does, and it contributes to this feeling of high economic policy uncertainty right now. One source actually pointed out that uncertainty levels are higher now than they were even during the peak of the trade war back in 2018.
Higher than 2018. That's saying something. It feels like businesses are just constantly trying to guess what's next.
Precisely. Meanwhile, domestically, the Trump administration seems focused on some internal stuff. Structural reforms.
Like what kind of reforms?
Things aimed at shrinking the size of government, streamlining personnel spending. They've apparently had consecutive months of reducing the government workforce. And there are plans for cuts in high-ranking military positions, too.
Okay, so sort of tightening the belt internally. Is the idea to shore up finances? Maybe pave the way for those tax cuts people keep talking about.
That seems to be the connection, yes. Improving fiscal stability, potentially creating room for tax cuts later in the year. It's all part of the political and economic calculation.
Right. But then you have the U.S. Treasury Secretary sounding pretty optimistic, echoing Warren Buffett, actually.
Yeah, that whole never bet against America line. He's been quite bullish, calling the U.S. economy unstoppable, even anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile.
Yeah, basically, the idea that it gets stronger from shocks. The message is that the long-term trajectory is up, and he sees the U.S. entering a new economic golden age. He's basically saying, invest here now.
A golden age? That's a strong statement.
Yeah.
But it seems like that view isn't universally shared around the globe. We saw some data suggesting global perceptions of the U.S. have shifted.
That's a really crucial counterpoint. The Brookings Institution did a survey, and it showed a pretty significant drop in trust towards the U.S., specifically from Taiwan.
Really? Taiwan?
Yeah. For the first time, a majority there feel Trump hasn't actually made Taiwan safer. And distrust now outweighs trust.
Wow. Let's shift gears, though. Let's talk about the new Taiwan dollar, the NTD. It's been appreciating quite strongly. What's behind that?
Yeah, it's been a really noticeable move. There are several factors really pushing it up. First off, you've got strong foreign capital inflows.
Money coming into Taiwan.
Exactly. Foreign investors seem pretty optimistic about Taiwan's economy and its industries. So they're buying up Taiwanese stocks, significant net purchases, actually.
And to buy stocks, they need NT dollars.
Precisely. That increases demand, which attracts even more of that, hot money, short-term investment looking for returns.
Okay, so strong investment is one piece. What else?
Second, there's been quite a bit of U.S. dollar selling by Taiwanese exporters and hedging activities.
Why are they selling dollars?
Well, all this trade uncertainty we just talked about, especially U.S. tariff policies, it makes holding U.S. dollars risky for them. So they're converting USD back into NTD to reduce that risk.
Trying to protect themselves.
Right. And this selling increases the supply of U.S. dollars in the market, putting upward pressure on the NTD. There were actually 3 big waves of this selling noted in late April and early May.
3 waves. Okay. So investment flows, exporter actions. What about the U.S. dollar itself?
That's the third factor. The U.S. dollar has generally been weakening. There's growing expectation that the U.S. Federal Reserve might cut interest rates later this year.
And that makes the dollar less attractive?
Relatively speaking, yes. So the U.S. dollar index has been declining. And when the dollar weakens, other currencies, especially Asian ones like the NTD, the Japanese yen, the Korean won, they tend to strengthen.
And the NTD really strengthened, didn't it?
It did. It broke through the 32 NTD per USD level in late April and even briefly touched an intraday high around 29.59 in early May. That's the strongest it's been in nearly 3 years.
Wow. Okay, any other contributing factors?
A couple more. Taiwanese life insurance companies hold a lot of U.S. dollar assets, like U.S. bonds.
Right.
So as those bonds mature, or maybe just as part of their regular hedging needs, they might be converting U.S. dollars back into NTD for settlement. That adds to the demand for NTD.
Okay, so big institutional flows too. And what about the U.S.-Taiwan trade talks themselves?
That seems to be playing a role too. Factor number 5, maybe. There's generally a positive market expectation about progress in those talks.
The idea being that Taiwan might get a better deal.
Yeah, potentially more favorable terms on tariffs. That kind of optimism can attract foreign investment and give the NTD another boost.
So it's like a confluence of factors all pushing in the same direction.
Yeah.
Has Taiwan's central bank tried to slow this down?
They have intervened, yes, but somewhat conservatively. They're very aware of potentially being labeled a currency manipulator by the U.S.
That label again?
Exactly. So their intervention has mostly been at specific levels, like around the 31 NTD USD mark. It hasn't really been enough to, stop the overall appreciation trend.
Walking a tightrope. Now, I have to ask, because you see these things online. These rumors about Trump demanding the NTD go to like 13 to the dollar or some secret Mar-a-Lago agreement. Any truth there?
Zero. Absolutely none. The central bank, economists, they've all shot those down firmly. They're basically theoretical speculation, maybe wishful thinking by some, but completely detached from policy reality. Just noise.
Okay, good to clarify that. So this rapid appreciation, who wins, who loses?
Well, it's definitely a double-edged sword. For Taiwan's export-heavy industries, machinery, chemicals, ICT components, it's tough. Their products become more expensive overseas, hurting competitiveness, leading to exchange rate losses on their earnings.
Nice, exporting harder.
But on the flip side, imports become cheaper for Taiwanese consumers and businesses, so lower costs for imported goods, potentially more purchasing power for people in Taiwan.
So good for importers and consumers, potentially challenging for exporters.
That's the basic trade-off. Overall, it's this mix of capital flows, market psychology, the weaker dollar. It suggests we could see continued volatility in the short term. And that hot money aspect is something to watch, good for markets maybe now, but can be fickle.
And this isn't just a Taiwan story, right? We heard something similar from South Korea.
That's right. The Bank of Korea Governor Lee Chang-yong was reported by a Yonhap news agency mentioning something interesting at an Asian Development Bank meeting.
What did he say?
He noted the strong appreciation of the Korean won, which also had a recent high, and other Asian currencies. He suggested it was partly due to pressure from the U.S. government in meetings.
Pressure to appreciate their currency.
That was his reported take, yes. He also linked the appreciation to the growing optimism about those U.S.-China trade talks potentially reaching some kind of agreement.
Interesting. So maybe a bit of direct U.S. nudging, plus the broader trade optimism lifting several Asian currencies.
It adds another layer, suggesting it's a regional dynamic influenced by multiple forces, including potentially direct policy pressure.
Man, it's complex. Okay, let's round this out by looking at Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha. What's his take on the economy right now, based on the latest, like the Berkshire meeting?
Well, his overall message, based on reports and his comments at the meeting on May 3rd, is still one of long-term optimism for the U.S. But, and it's an important but, it's tempered with some specific cautions.
Okay, so still fundamentally bullish on America, but with some asterisks.
Exactly. He explicitly talked about American exceptionalism at the meeting, his core belief in the country's long-term potential. He thinks, despite challenges, the U.S. will prosper over the long haul. That hasn't changed.
Classic Buffett. But what are the cautions? What's worrying him?
His main concerns seem to be around U.S. fiscal policy. He specifically mentioned the fiscal deficit, running around 7% of GDP. He called that unsustainable, suggesting 3% would be more reasonable.
So too much government spending and debt.
That's the implication. He warned at the shareholder meeting about the potential risks this poses to the live-and-term value of the U.S. dollar. Too much debt, too much spending could devalue the currency down the road.
Right. So how does this cautious optimism translate into what Berkshire Hathaway is actually doing, their investment strategy?
Well, it's reflected in the fact that Berkshire is sitting on a record amount of cash right now. A huge pile.
Keeping their powder dry.
Precisely. And Buffett himself said he expects potential significant investment opportunities to pop up within the next 5 years. So it reads as, be cautious about current market valuations, expect some volatility perhaps, but be ready to deploy that cash when really good long-term opportunities appear. He's confident they will.
So, patience. Watch the fiscal situation, but fundamentally believe in the long game for the U.S. economy.
That sums it up pretty well. Long-term, bullish, but prudent about timing, mindful of fiscal risks, and potential short-term overvaluation. Optimism with a healthy dose of realism.
Okay, that brings together a lot. The twists and turns in U.S.-China trade, the forces driving the NTD, and Buffett's balanced view. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It really does. You can't look at any one piece in isolation.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given this deep interconnectedness, we've talked about the trade tensions, the currency swings, the policy shift. How might all this ultimately reshape the way businesses operate and where investment flows globally in the coming years? Definitely some food for thought there.
A big question to ponder.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Micky to Life. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
We really dove headfirst into those opening moves of the latest U.S.-China tariff situation.
Right. We looked at the actual tariffs, the details, and the sort of initial reactions, the statements flying back and forth.
Exactly. And we're going, well, even deeper. We want to explore how this trade war has been progressing. And what looks like, frankly, a dip in global trust towards the U.S.
Yeah, that's a big piece of it.
Plus, China's more recent public stance and those really interesting details around the U.S. Treasury Secretary meeting with his Chinese counterparts. Okay, so where should we start?
Well, maybe we should kick off with how these tariffs have, actually landed around the world and the impact on trust you mentioned.
Good idea. We've got some fascinating survey data here. There's one from the Brookings Institution focusing specifically on Taiwan. Taiwan's obviously pretty key in this whole U.S.-China dynamic, right?
Absolutely. Critical given their location and, well, the complex relationship with both sides.
So this survey, it showed a pretty significant drop in Taiwanese trust in the U.S. during the Trump administration. A huge 65% felt he didn't make Taiwan safer.
Wow, 65%.
And listen to this distrust in the U.S. It jumped from 24% up to 38%. It actually became more common than trust.
That's a major shift. It shows these tariffs aren't just, economic figures. They're affecting America's soft power, potentially causing instability.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, like you said, is this didn't automatically mean they suddenly loved China more.
Right. It wasn't a simple switch. It points to something more complex, maybe just general disappointment or a feeling of uncertainty.
Yeah, like they weren't suddenly pro-Beijing just because they were wary of Washington. And it wasn't just Taiwan, was it? There were broader shifts, too.
No, definitely not. That Ipsos survey, the one across 29 countries, it showed a similar trend, a sharp increase in negative views about the U.S.'s future influence.
And it hit some traditionally really strong U.S. allies hard, didn't it?
Yeah, that's what was striking. Places like Japan, Mexico, the U.K., France, Italy, Germany, and especially Canada, positive views just sort of collapsed there.
It really highlights how unilateral trade moves can have these, well, unintended diplomatic ripple effects.
You'd think those long-standing relationships would provide more of a cushion, maybe.
So how did this negativity actually, manifest itself beyond surveys?
Like, did people actually do anything differently?
Well, one way is through shopping habits. We saw reports of boycotts, especially up in Canada. U.S. goods supposedly being put on the lower shelves in supermarkets.
Huh. Like a quiet protest, aisle by aisle.
Exactly. Symbolic, maybe, but it shows consumer sentiment. Interestingly, you mentioned this trend wasn't as strong in Taiwan.
Right. Perhaps because, as the survey hinted, they just buy fewer U.S. products overall.
Could be. Less opportunity to put things on the bottom shelf, I guess. But it shows this trust issue isn't just abstract. It connects to things like boycotts and even specific companies.
Ah, like Tesla. That drop in European sales seemed pretty significant. That was linked in part to negative feelings towards Elon Musk. Not just business stuff, but his perceived alignment with the Trump administration, his government dealings, even support for certain European political parties.
So people saw hitting Tesla as a way to hit back at Trump's policies.
That seems to be the idea for some consumers, yeah. Like an indirect way to register disapproval of the tariffs and the wider political climate.
Man, so it's a chain reaction trade, public opinion, specific brands, and it wasn't just international blowback, right? Trump was dealing with stuff at home, too.
Oh, definitely. Back in the U.S., he was facing serious headwinds. His approval ratings were historically lowest 100-day rating since, 1953?
Wow, that's going way back.
And there were widespread protests, lots of public disagreement, likely including the tariffs. Even conservative polls showed growing discontent.
So pressure from all sides.
Yeah, and on top of that, legal challenges started popping up, questioning the very authority used to impose these tariffs.
Okay, so international disapproval, domestic unhappiness. Sound like these tariffs weren't universally popular. And legal questions, too. Let's get into that legal side a bit.
Sure. The main challenge was around the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. Some states argued it doesn't actually grant the president power to just, broadly adjust tariff rates like that.
Their point being that power belongs more to Congress.
Essentially, yes. Who gets to set tariffs and under what specific laws and circumstances? That was the core argument.
But wasn't there another law, something from the 70s, that does allow presidential tariff adjustments?
You got it. The 1974 Trade Act. That one does explicitly grant that authority under certain conditions. So the legal debate shifted.
Oh, fair.
It became about whether the current situation, the trade issues with China, qualified as an unusual and extraordinary threat needed to invoke IEPA for these tariffs.
So not if he could adjust tariffs, but which law applied and whether the situation met the legal bar for that specific law, IEPA.
Precisely. It got pretty technical.
Got it. So while the world was giving the U.S. the side eye and lawyers were arguing, what was China up to? They weren't just sitting back.
No, not at all. Publicly, China came out swinging very strong messaging. China won't kneel. China won't retreat. They even put out a video hammering that point home.
Right, projecting strength. Got to look tough for the home audience and the world stage, especially if America's standing seemed a bit shaky.
Absolutely. But behind that very public tough talk, there were these little signals, maybe hints of a different approach happening privately. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, just days before that whole no retreat video came out, a pretty high-level official from China's Ministry of Finance was spotted.
Where?
Entering the U.S. Treasury Department building in D.C. And this wasn't just anyone. They had credentials for top-level finance minister and central bank governor meetings. Plus, they had about 10 people with them.
Whoa. That's not a casual visit, especially right before blasting out a "we won't back down" message.
Exactly. And the fact that Chinese staff reportedly tried to block a South Korean journalist from taking photos, even demanding the photos be deleted.
Yeah, that screams, we don't want this getting out.
It really points to a, shall we say, flexible and pragmatic strategy. Tough talk publicly, but maybe exploring options privately.
Okay, that makes sense. Keep up appearances, but keep doors open.
And controlling the story went beyond just trying to keep meetings secret. Remember those social media posts around May 1st?
Vaguely. The ones claiming the U.S. was the one begging for talks.
That's the one. Accounts linked to the Chinese government started pushing this narrative that U.S. officials had proactively contacted China through multiple channels, desperate for trade discussions.
Making it look like the U.S. was crawling back.
Yeah.
That's smart PR.
Very smart. It allows China to potentially enter negotiations without looking weak or like they're conceding anything domestically. It saves face.
Gives them cover if they do end up compromising later. See?
Yeah.
They came to us.
Exactly. And there were even whispers about China maybe using the fentanyl issue, a huge concern for the U.S., as a potential lever to start talks.
Using a different issue to open the door on trade. Suggests they might actually want to engage, maybe find a way to persuade Trump?
It suggests a degree of seriousness, yeah. But what's really driving this apparent contradiction? The tough talk versus the quiet feelers.
That'd be the economy, right?
Yeah.
The actual impact of the tariffs.
The sources strongly suggest that. The economic pressure seems immense. The numbers are pretty stark.
Lay them on me.
Okay, first quarter of 2025, China's exports to the U.S. down 15%, imports from the U.S. down 10%.
Ouch.
But the shipping numbers are maybe even more dramatic. A 40% plunge in the number of ships going from China to the U.S. since early April.
40%. That's massive. That really paints a picture of disruption.
It really does. And canceled voyages. Through the roof. Up to 80 cancellations reported, maybe more by now. That's 60% higher than any month during the pandemic.
Wow. More than during the pandemic lockdowns. That's saying something.
It really shows the scale of this hit. And container volume, reportedly down 30% compared to before the 145% tariff hit.
So less stuff being shipped overall.
Yeah, significantly less. Add it all up, and some estimates suggest the total value of U.S.-China goods trade could plummet by over 80%.
80%? That's almost a complete halt. No wonder they might be looking for an off-ramp, even discreetly.
Absolutely. So if you had to summarize China's stance, it really seems like that phrase we discussed. I saw in Kyiv.
Right. Kneeling is possible, but I need both face and justification.
Exactly. They seem willing to compromise, potentially, but they need to maintain that strong public image and have a good story to tell about why they're doing it.
And the story about the U.S. begging for talks provides that perfect justification.
Precisely. It fits the narrative.
That's a really useful way to frame it. Public toughness, private pragmatism, driven by economic pain. Okay, so speaking of pragmatism, it sounds like the U.S. side is also looking for a way forward now with the Treasury Secretary's trip.
Yes, let's shift to that. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talked about this trip to Switzerland.
Right, I saw clips of that.
He mentioned he was initially going for Swiss meetings, but it turned out the key Chinese trade and economic team would also be in Switzerland then, traveling through Europe.
Convenient timing.
So they arranged to meet, I think he said, over a Saturday and Sunday. And given all this pressure we've discussed, this meeting feels pretty significant.
And did he frame it as a resumption of talks, like things had been stalled?
He did. He said something like, we hadn't had negotiations with China recently. He positioned it as happening because the world has been coming to the U.S. and China has been the missing piece.
Interesting phrasing.
He also acknowledged the current situation, those super high tariffs, is not sustainable, especially, he implied, for China. He even called the 145% and 125% rates the equivalent of an embargo.
So the U.S. feels the pressure too, but thinks China feels it more. And he specifically mentioned not wanting to decouple, right? Just fair trade.
Yeah, that was a key point he made. He said the Swiss meeting was agreed upon, and the immediate goal probably wasn't some grand big trade deal.
More like putting out the fire first.
Pretty much. He used the word de-escalate. The idea being that you need to cool things down before you can make real progress on the bigger stuff.
That makes total sense. You can't negotiate well when everything's exploding. What about the existing tariffs, though? The elephant in the room. Any hint of lowering them as a goodwill gesture?
Someone asked him directly, actually, about maybe temporarily dropping the 145% reciprocal tariff down to 50% to show good faith. He wouldn't bite. Very cagey about negotiating strategy. He just said, everything's on the table. And he reiterated Trump's threat of a uniform tariff on everyone if talks fail.
Right. Keep him guessing. That sounds deliberate. Did he talk about that uncertainty?
He did. He called President Trump's style strategic uncertainty, said it's designed to get the best deal possible.
Even if it makes Wall Street nervous.
Yeah. He acknowledged Wall Street prefers predictability. The lack of information makes them uneasy, but framed it as a necessary tactic.
And the worst case scenario, no deal.
His answer was blunt. We'll survive. Again, framing it as strategic toughness showing they're willing to walk away.
Tough talk, but you mentioned those reports of half-empty ships heading to the U.S. West Coast.
Right. CNN and others reported that. So the tough talk meets the reality of economic impact hitting right now.
And didn't the secretary also clarify the decoupling thing? Like, it's not about everything.
Exactly. He drew a line, said the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to decouple over, quote, textiles and things like that.
Okay, so clothes and stuff.
But they do want to decouple over strategic industries, steel, semiconductors, medicines, critical things. The goal is bringing strategic and precision manufacturing back to the U.S.
Learning from supply chain scares, what he called the beta test.
Precisely. It's about national security, being self-sufficient in key areas, not cutting all economic ties.
Gotcha. So selective decoupling. And did he push back against negative economic forecasts about the tariffs?
Yeah, he specifically mentioned investor Paul Tudor Jones, who was apparently quite bearish, worried about tariffs plus the Fed's interest rate stance.
And Besson's take?
He argued trade friction can decrease, and Americans can get fairer deals ultimately. He also pointed to Trump's actions pushing other countries to renegotiate trade deals, like the UK-India agreement.
Sort of a, see, our tough stance works globally argument.
Pretty much. And there was that anecdote about the toy industry, Mattel, right?
Yeah, raising the point that maybe making toys in the U.S. isn't cost-effective anymore, suggesting tariffs might be permanent.
But the secretary countered, didn't he? Saying toys used to be made in the U.S., and he pointed out other countries, like Indonesia, where Barbie is supposedly made now, have strong U.S. trade deals, implying maybe shifts are possible.
Interesting back and forth. And he tied all this trade stuff back to helping average American families, didn't he?
Absolutely. When a reporter pushed him on the cost of things like toys for kids, he pivoted to the bigger picture.
Which was?
That working-class families can be hopeful again, thanks to Trump's efforts to, reorient the economy. Talked about homeownership, education, economic freedom.
Framing it as a long-term play for the American worker, even with short-term pain. And he wasn't shy about criticizing the media coverage, was he?
Not at all. Called press coverage predictably bad, suggested bias against Trump's policies. He also said Wall Street likes the status quo, but Trump has the courage to tackle trade imbalances others ignored.
Laying the blame on previous administrations.
Explicitly said past presidents let other countries take advantage of the U.S.
It's a very clear narrative. Strong leader fixing past mistakes. And lastly, he talked about the shape of the U.S. economy itself.
Yeah, the barbell economy idea. Strong finance and tech at the ends, but the middle, manufacturing, needs rebuilding. It's only about 8% of U.S. jobs now.
And he thinks manufacturing jobs are key.
He cited research saying they're crucial for real wage growth. So bolstering manufacturing is part of the goal behind these trade policies.
Okay, perfect time for a quick breather. We want to give a quick shout out to our old friend Micky. He runs a YouTube channel, Micky to Life.
Oh, yeah, Micky.
Yeah, it's got some genuinely fun stuff on there, just lighthearted, makes you chuckle. Speaking of which, you ever try assembling furniture? Like from those flat packs?
Oh, don't get me started. The diagrams. It's like modern hieroglyphics designed by someone who hates you.
Right. I built a nightstand once, and when I finished, the drawer was somehow on the outside facing backwards. I still don't know how I managed it. Needed like an engineering degree for a piece of particle board.
Tell me about it. I tried making sourdough bread during that whole craze. My starter looked less like something that would make bread and more like something from a science experiment gone wrong. My apartment smelled vaguely swampy.
Mimic skagging. Okay, maybe skip the sourdough. Anyway, check out Micky's channel, Micky to Life. Probably less stressful than our DIY projects. We'll be right back. All right, we are back. So let's try and wrap this up. We've really covered a lot of ground today, digging into what happened since those latest U.S.-China tariffs went up.
Yeah, we saw how these actions seem linked to that noticeable dip in global trust towards the U.S., even among traditional allies.
And we looked at China's interesting position, that really tough public talk versus, behind-the-scenes moves suggesting they want or maybe need to talk, driven by some pretty serious economic pain, it seems.
Definitely. That economic pressure, the shipping numbers, the potential trade drop, it all points towards a strong motivation to find some kind of resolution, even while maintaining that strong facade.
And then there's the upcoming meeting in Switzerland. The U.S. Treasury Secretary heading over, meeting China's lead rep. The focus seems to be de-escalation first.
Right. Cooling things down seems to be priority one. Both sides signaling they're willing to talk, but each playing their cards close to the vest, managing their own narratives.
It's super complex, isn't it? This constant balancing act between public perception, domestic politics, and the hard economic facts on the ground.
Absolutely. Both sides are clearly feeling the pinch from these tariffs and the path forward. Still really uncertain, lots of moving parts.
So as you're processing all this, here's something to chew on. Given these shifts in trust, the intense economic pressures, and this push towards selective decoupling in strategic areas, how might all this ultimately reshape not just trade routes, but the fundamental power dynamics globally, the whole structure of international relations?
That's the big question, isn't it? What does the world look like after this reshuffle?
Definitely something to keep thinking about.